I request all the dignitaries to take the seats on the dais, please. Victor Hugo quoted that to learn to read is to light a fire. Every syllable that is spelled out is a spark. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you. I am Safa Ustad.
And I am Jannavi Dakle.
We are delighted to have you here at Maharashtra Institute of Technology, Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar, for a truly special occasion, an evening dedicated to literature, learning, and the love of books, courtesy of the CSN Book Club.
Reading is essential for those who seek to rise above the ordinary, said by James Brown. Absolutely, and today we are here to celebrate that very spark and curiosity. The CSN Book Club is not just an event, it's a vibrant platform that unites readers, thinkers, and writers, sparking meaningful conversation and kindling the joy of reading.
Let's take a moment to appreciate what makes this initiative so special. The CSN Book Club, an initiative of MIT CSN, aims to foster a rich literary culture in our academic and social spaces.
It's a place where expression meets authors, readers, and students come together to explore new thoughts and engage with the stories that shapes our lives. Through insightful discussions, book reviews, and author interaction, the club is creating a powerful community of curious mind.
With every session, we dive into a new journey. And today, for the sixth session of the CSN Book Club, we have the immense honor of welcoming an acclaimed economist and author who brings history and migration alive through his powerful writing.
To begin with this evening on the note of gratitude and honor, we now invite Professor Munish Sharma Sir, Director General, GS Mandal, to present a token of appreciation to Professor Chinmay Tumbe Sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. We are immensely honored to welcome Professor Chinmay Tumbe Sir, Associate Professor in the Economics area at IIM Ahmedabad, as today's distinguished speaker. Professor Chinmay Tumbe Sir is a renowned scholar and writer celebrated for his deep research on migration, cities, and economic history. He is the author of two acclaimed books, India Moving, A History of Migration, published in 2018, and The Age of Pandemics 1817 to 1920, published in 2020, both of which have received wide appreciation for their insights into India's socio-economic fabric. He brings with him a rich and diverse academic background. He completed his fellow program in management PhD equivalent from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, where he was listed on the director's merit list for academic excellence and also captained the IIMB football team. He pursued his he pursued his MSc in economics from the prestigious London School of Economics and Political Science, supported by the J.N. Tata Endowment Fund and K.C. Mahindra Scholarship. Undergraduate journey began with a BA in Economics and Mathematics at Roya College, Mumbai, where he laid the foundation for his academic excellence. And even before that, his school years were shaped at the esteemed Rishi Valley School in Andhra Pradesh, known for its holistic and value driven education. Professor Chinmay Tumbe Sir has held prestigious positions such as Asia Global Fellow at the University of Hong Kong, visiting scholar at Harvard Business School, and Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. He has also served as faculty at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, and has actively contributed to public policy through the COVID 19 India Task Force and the Migration Working Group under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. At IIM Ahmedabad, Professor Chinmay Tumbe sir teaches highly impactful courses like pandemics, macroeconomics and policy, and urban economy and business environment, which continue to inspire and shape the minds of future economists and policymakers. His academic journey has been adorned with prestigious recognitions such as the Madan Mohanka Research Publication Award in 2018 from IIM Ahmedabad for excellence in international business research, the Exim Bank IERA Award in 2015 for his outstanding contributions to economic research, the Director's Merit List Award for Academic Excellence at IIM Bangalore in 2010, and was awarded the J.N. Tata Endowment Fund Scholarship and the K.C. Mahindra Scholarship in 2005 to pursue higher studies abroad. Professor Chinmay Tumbe sir's work not only bridges academics and policy but also sparks public dialogue, making him a perfect fit for the CSN Book Club's mission of bringing intellectuals and readers together. So today, we are privileged to have you here with us, sir. Once again, we welcome you, sir.
Now, let's turn the spotlight to the highlight of this evening, the review and discussion on the insightful book India Moving, A History of Migration. We are thrilled to invite Professor Chinmay Tumbe sir to share his thoughts, research, and stories behind the book that redefines how we understand the movement of people across the India's history. Sir, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for a very kind introduction, especially the football captain bit, which everyone forgets during introductions, but probably the proudest thing on that introduction. I love playing sports, and sports is a good place to start talking about migration. Migration is a hot topic around the world today, especially in Europe. You know, they hate immigrants suddenly, especially except when it comes during football World Cups. Right? So France won the World Cup, and they said it's because of France. But almost everyone in the French football team is an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. But when there are problems, then the problems are those of migrants. Right? So, as a famous German footballer said, who was Turkish German, Mesut Özil, he said, "When I score a goal, I'm German. When I don't score a goal, I'm Turkish." Yeah, so this is a common problem migrants face around the world, to belong to a place or not. My name is Chinmay Tumbe. So probably the first point to start is, who am I? Most of us here are migrants. So all of you are probably migrant workers, migrant students, or children of migrant workers, children of migrant students, or grandchildren of migrant workers, or grandchildren of migrant students, or some end generation migrant, right? And you can take it back all the way to Africa, which is about maybe 40, 50,000 years back. In terms of my own identity, it's remarkable because it starts with a migration story. Tumbe is a name of a village in Udupi in South India, coastal Karnataka. And most people think it's Maharashtrian because you have Tambes and Tembes, but we are the only Tumbes in the world. Right? You can actually check it online. Though now when you Google Tumbe, we have a new family song, Tumbe da Zumba. Ayushmann Khurrana sings this song. So thanks to that, we are now back in the Google search pages. But we think of it as a family song. Somebody has sung a song on our surname. But Tumbe is interesting place to start our discussion because I was born in Shivaji Park in Mumbai, and my father was born in Shivaji Park in Mumbai, which is a center of cricket. My father was a cricketer. I also played cricket. A lot of people have played cricket at Shivaji Park, as you know. It's a mecca of Indian cricket. It's also where the Thackeray family used to stay. And the Thackerays, as you know, the Shiv Sena as a party has had a history of having anti-migrant political rhetoric. I say rhetoric because often they didn't really do anything, but it was often in speaking, right? So in the 1960s, if you've seen the movie on Bal Thackeray or have read anything about the history of politics, there was an anti-South Indian movement where Bal Thackeray was a very good cartoonist who would draw cartoons called SI vultures, South Indian vultures, and so on. And so later on, now there's an anti-North Indian movement, but earlier it was an anti-South Indian movement. And so our family, we lived next to the Thackeray's, good family friends, because everyone knew each other back then. And so head of the family chose to change our surname to sound Maharashtrian. Right? Which is a good starting point for migration studies, because often a lot about identity is, do you belong to that place, right? So in any case, everyone speaks, Marathi in the family, even though one is Kannadiga in origin. So that's a little story about Tumbe, because you see how powerful migration is as a phenomenon, as an identity construction. And in India, in most cases, you kind of know where a person is from through the surname. Tells you a bit about region, it tells you a bit about caste, tells you a bit about religion. And that's why surname is, of course, a very important part. Instantly, often when in conversations, you come across a slightly unusual surname. You often ask, where are you from? Right? And this is what the book is about. Where are you from? The second part of this covers page is the train. Right? And the train is a very important part of what we're going to speak, because the train has been very central in the story of migration for the last 150 years. The story of internal migration. And of course, then you have ships and planes, which is about the story of international migration. So over the next half an hour, I will give you a flavor of how Indians move or have moved over the last 150 years within India and outside India, right? And of course, this is not something which should be boring, because it connects with your own personal lives. All of you are curious to know where you came from, and many of the answers will be found in the book. So I can't cover everything in 30 minutes. So that's a plug for my book. You need to read the book to understand it. But many of the things will not be in the book, which means you should write a book, right? So that should be a trigger for your own understanding of where you come from. So we will cover lots of common communities like the Marwadis, Gujaratis. We will cover, refugee migration a little bit. We will cover about why there are so many Keralites in the Gulf. There are some Keralites in the room as well. Why there are so many South Indians in the US, for instance. Why the Gujaratis in East Africa. Why there are so many Marwadis in Aurangabad. That's an important question to be asked in the world of business history in particular. Okay, so that's a little bit about what I'm talking. But a little minute on why write a book, and how did I personally get into this. This is a project which started about in 2007 when I wrote an essay as a student in London called Migration, What Next? And it was an essay for a prize competition. And the question on the prize was development, where next? And you had to write an essay, and if you wrote the essay and if it was liked by this jury, they would give you £1,000, which is a lot of money as a student, even today, but also back then. As it turns out, I won that essay. So I said, okay, what I written must have been interesting. And what I basically wrote was, migration is going to be the central topic we're all going to be talking about very soon. And in a very strange way, it did become true. It was not the case in 2008, but today, the reason Donald Trump is in power is immigration, hugely. The reason why Meloni is in power in Italy is immigration. Immigration rhetoric. Again, there's a difference between rhetoric and actual policy. Immigration has doubled in Italy, even though an anti-immigration politician was elected. So the reason I wrote this book was because I did research for 10 years. I tracked migrants in general compartments of trains. Initially, during my research, I used to basically take train journeys across India. Some of them are very long, like the three-day long Puri-Oka Express starts from Orissa, ends in Gujarat. So I spent a lot of time on trains. I should add, my parents met in the Bombay local train, so I owe my existence to a local train. So I wouldn't be standing here without the Indian train. And the Indian trains taught me a lot about how people move, why they move. And we're talking of people who are not very rich, people who are often going without a ticket. And it was very humbling to know, why people make these decisions to move very long distances. And then very quickly I realized that what I was studying was not new, in the sense that people have been moving often these same journeys. Their fathers did it, their grandfathers did it, in some cases their great-grandfathers did it. Right? So many of these migrations we're talking about have been going on for more than 100 years, which is remarkable. It's never really been documented that way in many other parts of the world. So that's what led me to history. And that's why the book is a history of migration, because to understand today's migration, you have to understand what happened in the past. So if you think of the classic Bihari migrant in Pune or Mumbai or Delhi, Biharis have been on the move for a long time. And it's not just Biharis, but particular districts within Bihar. Just like it's not the Maharashtrian on the move, but a particular few clusters within Maharashtra where people send to, send a lot of people out. Okay, so on that note, that's why the book was written, to tell the story of migration. I wrote a lot of research papers before the book came out, and the book was written with a publisher called Penguin. And it came out in 2018. There is a Marathi translation called Firasta Bharat, and there's some other translations on the way. So it's a 7-year-old book, but it's a timeless topic, right? And I think it can be enjoyed at any given point of time. Okay, so I'll start with a figure who's probably famous in this region, which is Malik Ambar. Right? And all of you might have heard of Malik Ambar as some sort of a figure of history. And his color of his skin, black, rose up to nobility in this region, the Deccan region, Ahilya-nagar, Ahmednagar in particular. But what's interesting is about his life. Right? So if you want to know about Indian migration before 1500, there's a section in the book which does that. If you want to know about the Aryan, migration hypothesis, Indo-Aryan migration hypothesis, where did Indians come from, genetic studies, the whole controversy on that. There's a part of the book on that, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to start this story first in the 1500s, and then fast forward to 1850s, and then fast forward to the 20th century. Okay, but this is an interesting story because it tells you one form of migration throughout history was not voluntary, but involuntary, which is that people were forcibly taken from one place to another. And slavery was not just in the US or Africa, it was around the world. And in India, some slaves were taken from Africa via Arabia, and that's how they came to the Deccan region in the 1500s in large numbers. And their descendants are still there. They're called the Siddhi community. They are found in Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Karnataka even today. And the Siddhis are basically descendants from these Habshi slaves, as they were called. But what's interesting is that unlike the slaves in the African continent who went to the US, a lot of the slaves in India actually found freedom. And not just freedom, they rose to the top. And in this particular case, remarkable mobility. And he not only rose to the top, but he was a very important figure to fight against the Mughals at a particular point. And as per some records, an inspiration for the tactics of Shivaji much later on. Right? So starting from this very interesting episode of Indian history, where you have slavery, involuntary migration from a long distance, that is Africa, coming into India, intermingling. And then you have, of course, slavery from the eastern region, Bengal, Burma, going to Dutch Indonesia. You have slaves from Pondicherry, French Pondicherry, going to the French islands, plantation islands, some from Tamil Nadu, again, going to islands, in Africa. But on the whole, slavery kind of ended in India I mean, no actual records of slavery by the time you reach the 18th century in mass numbers. There was slavery before that, but not so much after that. This is one kind of mobility throughout history. Forced, involuntary. Sometimes you got freedom, sometimes you did not. But obviously, people have been on the move throughout history. And the most obvious being pilgrimage. You move for pilgrimage, and in India, Shankaracharya, the four corners of India were well mapped out. So there was a lot of movement on pilgrimage-based migrations. It's the reason Surat became one of the largest cities of the world in the 17th century, because it was an important point of stop for people going to Mecca. You had different types of mobility for the military, right? So think of the campaigns of the Mughals as they came south, and these were migrations which lasted often for decades. So you can think of migration in different forms: pilgrimages, overall movement in terms of spies, merchant migrations, etc. But throughout Indian history for the last 2000 years, the category of migrant, which is not really seen as migration, which has always happened, is the most sizable one, is migration for marriage. Right? And so the starting point of our discussion today is that virtually every adult Indian woman is a migrant, right? Because you move upon marriage. It's so obvious that we miss it. But the census of India today counts about 350 million women as migrants. Right? And these are not necessarily next village. They are often substantial distance. A lot of the big migrations are from Eastern India to Northwest India in terms of women-based migration. And they've been going on for centuries. Right? So women's migration is actually the largest category of migration that has happened and continues to happen. You might say that's true everywhere in the world. Not quite, because we have certain norms on marriage which are very strict, which requires you to step out of the village. Right? So even in India, Tamil Nadu does not see that much of women's migration, because a lot of the marriages happen within the village, what we call as village endogamy. Whereas in most other parts of India, you have village exogamy, which means you have to marry as a rule, as a social custom rule outside the village. Right? So this is very specific to India in the scale of women's mobility. That is, virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant. And how do you define a migrant? If you look at the census, it's typically people in any area is a migrant if you're either born outside, or if you stayed out, if you come from outside, what is called as place of last residence. Typically, if you've been staying in a place which is different from the place of your usual residence for more than 6 months, 1 year, you're considered to be a migrant. Right? So 350 million women migrants in India. And arguably that's happened for the last 2000 years, at least when the system of village exogamic rule was started. So that's not your classic picture. When I show you a picture of a man here, or even a picture of the train which I showed you first up, which was mostly men. So the picture of migration is men. But who are actually moving in India for the last 2000 years is women. Okay. And important to understand, because it's the women's mobility that actually connects the cultural fabric of India. So if you want to understand how languages are formed, or how languages move from one part of the country to the other, it's actually through women. Which means, for example, think of the border between, say, Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, Kannada speaking zone, Telugu speaking zone. There's obviously a bridge in between where people speak both the languages, right? But it's actually the women who are doing that job, because they are the ones who are moving across those short distances. So it's the women of India who actually kind of hold the cultural plurality of the country through these marriage-based migration. It's not just language, it's food habits, right? Because you take your food habit from one region to another. So when we say migration leads to a kind of cultural diffusion, the migration which is actually doing that in a very subtle, slow moving way for 1500 plus years that we know of is actually this very simple migration for marriage, right? And I'm sure many people in the room will directly associate with that. Okay, so I'll move on from this particular figure of slave migration, because I made this point just to point out one extreme, which is involuntary, and marriage migration, which is hopefully voluntary, maybe not, right? But sometimes marriages might be involuntary, and you might be forced, you might think it's slavery, but for our definitional purposes, it's going to be voluntary. And then we come to the 19th century. This particular image, the title at the bottom says, Hill Coolies Landing at Mauritius. Okay, I was in Patna in the Bihar State Archives, and all the researchers around me were from Mauritius. Right? Why? Because this is a migration which happened 150 years back, but the records of those migrations are still there. Which ship, who went on each ship. So you can, if you're in Mauritius, you can actually now trace which ship your ancestors came from. It's all there in Patna in that one little office called the Bihar State Archive. Okay, because 90% of Mauritius ethnic stock is not just from India, it's from 2 or 3 districts of Bihar. Right? And 1834 is an important date of Indian history, because while we say that a lot of people from outside India came here, like Malik Ambar, like the Mughals, themselves initially, think of a lot of the invasions before 1500s. That's in migration. Then there's out migration to some extent towards Southeast Asia, like the Chola Empire. Think of the reason why Bali even today is 80% Hindu. So there's that sense of out migration. But real large-scale out migration from the Indian subcontinent starts with this important image, because this is the time the British start recruiting people for plantations across the world. And they do this in 1834 because they abolish slavery in 1834. Right? And that is why they need new forms of labor, and they choose Indian labor because they're ruling India at that time. And so Indians start moving around the world. So the reason why you see a Chandrapal in the West Indies cricket team, or you see a V.S. Naipaul, who was a great Caribbean writer whose ancestry is from Gorakhpur in Uttar Pradesh, or you see why Gandhiji himself went to South Africa. The reason for this mass-scale dispersion of Indians starts with this particular image out here. And the first people taken to Mauritius were actually not from Bihar. They were from what you today call as Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. They were tribal folks, seen to be sturdy people, but very quickly the recruitment networks changed towards Bihar. Partly because Bihar by then already was supplying a large part of the military force of the British. So if you see the East India Company, which was the ruling force at that time, the Bengal native infantry, almost all the people working there came from one part of Bihar called Saran district. And it's them who went to Singapore and settled down Singapore. It's them who then joined these recruitment networks and started going around the world. So if you look at the Caribbean islands, Suriname, South America, if you look at Mauritius, look at Fiji, a huge part of that migration is the Bhojpuri-speaking migrant. Right? And we'll come back to this place called Bihar in just a bit. Now, this is a starting point of wide-scale dispersion from India. Right? And then come the railways. So 1834 is the ship taking Indians out of India. And this is a beautiful image called Modes of Traveling in India. Okay, it was published in the late 19th century, which shows you the British drew this diagram. And they say, okay, people crawl across India, they go on palki docks, they go on different forms of transport. They're on elephants. And the last image, which many of you may not be able to see, is an image of the railways. Okay, it's like the railways have arrived, and all other forms of movement are now ancient history. Because what the railways do, and for 2000 years, the speed of movement was conditioned by the speed of the horse. India did not really have great navigable rivers, unlike many countries of the world or regions of the world. So we didn't really have extensive internal mobility through river systems. It was essentially the speed of the horse. And what the railways did was to increase horsepower substantially. And they just made it much more quicker to move across the subcontinent. So what you got was then mass mobility. And people started moving more and more after Bombay and Thane were connected, famously in 1853. So by the time you reach the 20th century, you start getting very strong migration corridors in India. The way to understand migration in India is not really a state. Yes, you say Bihar, colloquially, sends a lot of people. You say Kerala. But it really happens at the micro level, at the district level often. And it's often a place to a particular place. A network is formed. And when a network is formed, it's very strong. Okay, so this is an image of a particular family from a place called Ratnagiri. And all of you are aware of Ratnagiri as a place famous for mangoes. I'm sure all of you know of the Apus mango. The season is on. But in migration studies, Ratnagiri is famous for man goes. Right? So the man is migrating out, and he's going for a really long period of time, typically entire lifetime, but not settling down and coming back. So what in migration studies we call as semi-permanent migration. You go out, spend 10 months outside, but then come back for 1 or 2 months and do this for 30, 40 years, typically the man, not the woman. So the woman is at home looking after family, looking after the land, and so on. Think of security guards on your campus. Many of them actually fit this bill. And this form of migration is what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. It's the world's largest and longest voluntary migration system that has been in place for at least 130 years. It is also called as the missing men phenomenon, because in these districts, the sex ratios are so skewed towards women in Ratnagiri because the men are outside. So if you look at the sex ratio of age group 20 to 40, there are very few men. There are lots of men outside. So we have the missing women phenomenon, what Amartya Sen coined, but this is the missing men phenomenon. And this is true of not just Ratnagiri, but in my estimation, about 150 districts of India out of 700 districts of India. So about 20% of rural India has faced persistent mass migration for more than 100 years, which means the man goes, spends career outside, comes back, then his son goes, spends a career outside, comes back, his son goes and comes back, going on for at least 4 or 5 generations. It goes on today, even today in Ratnagiri. If you go to Ratnagiri, the men are either in Bombay or in the Gulf, around the world, and most of them actually do not settle, they go back. That's the interesting thing, what we call as circular migration. And that is the fundamental type of migration in India when you look at the numbers. Okay. So this is one family. The gentleman out here, so this is when we went to Ratnagiri villages and did these studies. This is a photograph from this family album, who worked his life on the docks. And then, basically this is a rare photograph where the whole family came to Bombay. They took this photograph in Chembur in Bombay. But the family is now back. And the boy that you see out here is now working in Bombay. Right? So this is an image which tells you that story. This is another family photograph of, people from Udupi taken in Mumbai. This is my own family, right? And my father is the person sitting at the bottom. He was superimposed on this photograph. He was not born at the time of the photograph, but then they thought he'd feel bad. So they, when they were reconstructing this photograph, they put my father back. So there's a bow tie. You see, it's a complete misfit in the photograph, but they just cropped him from somewhere else and put him in this photograph. But what's interesting about this family is that this is a family which moved from Udupi, which, like Ratnagiri, has faced persistent mass outmigration, continuing even today for more than 100 years. And people send back money during that time. So Ratnagiri and Udupi are remittance economies, money order economies, when we used to have money orders. Today, money orders have collapsed. So remittance economies. But this is, unlike the previous family, a family which settled down in Bombay. So you see these two types, one which goes back and one which settles. And you also want to understand, why does that happen? Why do some families settle down and why do some go back? So 2 districts, Ratnagiri, Udupi. But it's not those just 2 districts. It's, as I said, 150 plus districts of India. Right? So this is a map of India at the district level, not the state level. Right? Each block is a district, and the district boundaries of 2011. And all the red shaded districts are the districts of mass outmigration. What does mass mean? Typically, 25% of households have at least one member of the household outside, which means if you walk in a village, 1 in 4 households has someone working outside. Okay, this is absolutely mass migration. All the red shaded districts are remittance economies, which means money either from outside India, like Kerala. The red in Kerala is all going to Gulf mostly. Right? The money is coming from outside. So we have international remittances, we have domestic remittances. And what's really interesting about this map is that the richest parts of India and the poorest parts of India have the same rates of outmigration. Let it soak in a bit, right? So for example, Kerala is today one of the richest parts of India on per capita income, on almost any development indicator you take, way ahead of Bihar. But Bihar and Kerala have the same rates of outmigration. So if you thought, why does migration happen? Must be poverty, lack of opportunities. That's why people have to move. If they had everything, why would they move? Right? But what this map tells you is that fundamentally, what drives migration is actually not per capita income, But what connects all these districts is something called as density. And density not on land, but density on farmable land, what we call as arable land. So Rajasthan is very less density because it's a lot of desert. But if you look at arable land, farmable land, it's actually, density is not that low. Okay. So why density is important? Because Indian population grew by about 4 or 5 times in the last 100 years. And on the same land, you can improve productivity to some extent, but there's only that much you can do. And so fundamentally, there's no way that in most places, agriculture itself or non-agriculture in rural areas can actually support the local economy, which means you have to move in order to basically earn a living. Right? So people are moving from Kerala, which is the richest part of India on many metrics. People are moving from Bihar. Same rates of out-migration into place. And much of central India is blank on this map because densities are actually much lower there. Right? So that's the first point. Why do people move, especially for work, this is for work? Essentially density. Right? And what explains density? We have to go back into history, access to water sources, less invasion, less wars, why a population grows at a particular place over time. Right? So you have to go back much further. The second reason is networks. As I said, Bihar, the British used to recruit from there. Those recruitment networks were very strong. So the British, thanks to Gandhi and others, they had to abolish indentured labor system, like going to Mauritius in about 1917. But the migrations didn't stop. They stopped going to Mauritius, but they started going to Bombay because the pressure to move was always there. Right? So you have all these districts. Let me just point out a bit about this map. The entire west coast of India, including blocks in Goa. You might think Goa is this destination place. There are lots of places in Goa where people are leaving, going out, working their lives and coming back. Right? Literally every district from Ratnagiri to Kanyakumari on one side of the Western Ghats is basically on the out-migration map. And on the other side of the Western Ghats, very little migration. Geographically, very, very close to each other. It's just a geographic accident. And that's how networks are formed. The information flows. In this case, the migration started towards Bombay first. They would go by boats and ships towards Bombay. Udupi. So why Udupi? They started with cooks. That's why Udupi restaurants are famous across India. They made a whole career in Bombay. So the Udupi restaurants you walk into across India, and if you ask them about their life histories, very few of them will settle down there. They will spend their entire lifetime in their restaurant, but they will go back and retire in Udupi. Right? This is what we mean by this particular migration. Okay. Then you have, and the interesting thing is almost every part of India is part of this great Indian migration wave in some form or the other, which means Gujarat, supposed to be a rich state, developed state. You might think of Gujarat as a place where people go to, and that's true. But even there are districts like Bhavnagar with mass out migration, on par with Saran district in Bihar. So it's about the network. Once the network is formed, it's very powerful. Udupi, for instance, is the second richest district of Karnataka today after Bangalore. Right? But it's the district with maximum out-migration. Right? Why? Because when you grow up in these red districts, you are expected to move. Because you grow up in a culture of migration. So what's happened in these red shaded districts is because this has happened now for 100 years, even if things are fine, you've seen everyone move. That's the norm. Right? So that's expected of you. And what's also interesting is that you're also expected to return, right? Because as you saw during pandemic, people walking back home, they would say, "Agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge," right? So that's a very strong sentiment, very strong attachment to ancestral property, which keeps people coming back as well. Okay. So the west coast of India, I mentioned a few districts, Rajasthan, lots of districts, entire Himalayan range. If you add Nepal on this map, even Nepal is a remittance economy. Uttarakhand is a remittance economy. Himachal, less so, but also. Right? Which means, and where are they going? They're going mainly to Delhi, but of course, many parts of India as well. The mangoes we talked about in Ratnagiri. The people from Ratnagiri don't really pluck the mangoes anymore. It's the people from Nepal. Right? And if you think of the Kerala out migration, for 40, 50 years they've been going to the Gulf. So who's doing the lower end jobs? It's not the Keralites really anymore. It's North Indians who are moving to Kerala. Right? So Kerala is a unique part of India. We have about 3 million people moving out, and you have 2.5 to 3 million people coming in from North India. Two ends of the labor market. Right? People who have become rich in the Gulf are not going to be building a house. So who's going to actually build the house with the money that they're sending to the Gulf? It's migrants from North India. North India means Bihar, Bengal, West Bengal also nowadays, and so on. So in films, Malayalam films, you have Bengali songs now, right? It's a phenomenon of the last 10, 20 years. Earlier, people from North India didn't really move to South India because of a language barrier. But today, the income differential is so high, you can learn a language because it's going to be paying. Right? So you have a lot of people working now in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, because the income difference is high. And the age dynamic is such that it's going to continue for the next 30, 40 years. Which means in our lifetimes, the biggest story of migration is north to south. Right? Because that's the south is aging so fast now, just like Europe is, that they have a huge demand for working age, especially labor class kind of jobs. Okay. Then there are districts in Orissa. The Puri Okha Express train that I talked about connects especially one district called Ganjam all the way to Surat, to Okha. So there are almost 500,000 people from one or two districts of Orissa, coastal Orissa, who work in Gujarat. Right? Power looms, lots of industries in Gujarat. Internal migration by train mostly. Okay. Then you have, of course, the world's largest migrant pool, which is Eastern UP and Western Bihar. Okay. So Eastern UP, Western Bihar, mostly the Bhojpuri speaking belt. Again, density is extremely high. Western UP, not many migrants. So in Mumbai, if you talk about the Bhaiya, right, it is not really the people from UP in general. It's people from Azamgarh, people from particular districts in Eastern UP. Famous movie on migration in Indian history is a movie called Gaman, where played by Farooq Sheikh. It's from Eastern UP, people coming, moving to Bombay in a large amount. Okay, now these migrations, as I said, are linked with networks, with history, a bit, of course, with per capita income, but it's really about density, about opportunities. And the reason I say this is because an argument in Indian policies and politics for the last 75 years is, if only we do enough rural development, people will not have to move to cities. In fact, I gave an exam once where the first question was, state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. Right? Not pros and cons. State the problems. Right? It's seen as a problem. Right? Because why would people move if it was not a problem? But that's not the way you look at migration. In a developing country, especially like India, migration is a guaranteed certainty because it's happened in every part of the world, including Europe. Donald Trump's grandfather moved from Germany to US, in the age of mass migration about 100 years back. About 50 million Europeans left Europe and went to US during their development phase. As USA was developing, they moved within the US. Mass internal migration from the East Coast towards Central and the West Coast. China just moved about 400 to 500 million people away from farms to factories. Rural to urban migration is a central fact of economic development. For the simple reason is that as you grow richer, you don't want to do back-breaking farm jobs. That's the reason why India's arguably most fertile agricultural zone, coastal Andhra Pradesh. If you go to coastal Andhra Pradesh, it is a rich agricultural block. Right? What has happened there? Has migration stopped? No, they got rich. They moved to Guntur, Vijayawada towns from the villages. From there, they moved to Hyderabad. And of course, the ultimate destination, US. Right? If you're born in coastal Andhra, you either, you have to do engineering and maybe come to MIT and then go to MIT US. It's stages of life for the person born in coastal Andhra. Think about Punjab, which until recently was a hugely economic, agriculturally dynamic place of India, especially in the Green Revolution phase. It drew in migrants to do the farm harvesting work, but Punjab is a huge belt for international outmigration. So this idea that it's a very important point to make because we often think if we do development, nobody will have to come. And especially people living in cities who love to curse migrants for everything. Right? Often many of us have moved to cities but failed to see ourselves as migrants. Right? And so we often kind of blame others or we want to stop others from coming. We have got the benefits of migration because us or our ancestors have moved. But then we say, now time is up. Now others should not move. Right? And as per the Indian Constitution, by the way, you can move. You can move and settle down anywhere in India, except a few districts. Okay, mostly in the northeast, until recently Himachal, Kashmir. but almost anywhere in India you can move and work. And people who are trying to stop it, for example, job reservation for locals, which is on the political manifesto of a variety of parties, is an anti-constitutional plank. And the Haryana government did it, and they had to scrap it because it was challenged in the High Court, and the High Court upheld the Indian Constitution saying you cannot have job reservation for locals. Okay, so job reservation for locals is an anti-constitutional thing in India. We have the freedom to move. In my way, that's a very good plank. Okay, so that's about internal migration. To give you a sense of where people are moving, this is a map of Bombay. Bombay draws in people from all over India. Delhi, mostly from the Gangetic belt. You think of Calcutta, only from the Bengal hinterland. Calcutta is a unique city of India, which is a city of net out migration. More people leave Calcutta than go to Calcutta today, which is not the case, suppose, 100 years back. Right? And you look at Surat, a lot of people going to Surat from Gujarat, Maharashtra, northern Maharashtra, but the bulk of it is coming from 1 or 2 districts in coastal Orissa. Right? So it's not just about distance. You might think the shorter distances, the more the migration networks, but sometimes the networks are so strong that they can take people from very, very far away and get you in a particular place. So moving now from labor migrations, low-income migrations, to mercantile migrations, business migrations. Right? And the remarkable aspect about India is that a few communities, what we call as the traditional business communities, still dominate the landscape of Indian business. So if you look at the 100 richest Indians, about 50 of them are Marwadi or Gujarati. Right? And when we say Marwadi or Gujarat, these are region-specific names, but we're really talking about Hindu Vaishya or Jain. It's not everyone from Marwar, it's not everyone in Gujarat, it's a particular caste community within. Right? So it's not the whole population as the relevant base. What's really interesting is that almost all the famous traditional business communities of India, I've highlighted them, Punjabis, which is Khatris and Aroras, Marwadis, Sindhis, Kutchis, Gujaratis, they all seem to come from one part of India. Right? And the only real business community which once was very famous, which is not anymore, were the Chettiars in South India. Right? But they're not really powerful as a business community today. There's a reason for that. They declined in Burma, huge shock in Burma. But the Chettiars 100 years back were more powerful than the Marwadis or the Gujaratis. They had a huge financial empire across Southeast Asia. Right? So Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, lots of these places where the Chettiars, again, it's a Vaishya community, so to speak, caste-wise. Literally one district, Sivaganga, which houses beautiful, houses, mansions out there, just like you'll find mansions in North India in the business clusters. And so some reasons for this. Okay, so demographically speaking, it's interesting. You think of the caste system, you think of a four-fold Varna order. Demographically, huge variations across India. Right? So when we used to have the caste census in the British times, right, Brahmins were about 6% of the Indian population, but in Kashmir it was huge. And as you went to South India, it fell. There were districts of India with 1% Brahmin, and the districts of India with 40% Brahmin. So you have huge variations across demography. And the Vaishya stock, because it's linked with business, also has this huge variation. Right? And the place where they are the largest is actually this place, Rajasthan, Gujarat, this particular belt that you're seeing here. Right? And so historians give different arguments. Some are based on religion, philosophy, ethos, new philosophies, attitudes to business. Because remember, in traditional Hindu interpretations of business, business was seen to be quite negative. Right? So Arthashastra, for instance, which has a lot of stuff on migration, famously cursed the trader. It said, beware of the trader. It's not really a text which is very pro trade. It's always control the trader. Right? The trader is seen as someone evil. Or you think of even Western civilizations where the Jewish person was seen as this evil moneylender, like Shakespeare's Shylock, for instance. Right? So merchants throughout history in different places have not really been seen necessarily positively. Okay? And that's true even in India, where the Sahukar or the moneylender is often portrayed as an evil person in novels, in literature, etc. Right? So in the 16th century and 17th century, in this western part of India, a lot of reform, or let's say religious churning, took place. You got new religious systems, Sikhism, for instance. You got Pushtamargi Vaishnavism, which is another kind of sect in Gujarat. And a lot of these churning was pro-business. In fact, the religious kind of structures were based on the success of the business. Because if the business did well, you would give money to build the temples, the gurudwaras, and so on. So there was a nice patronage linked with business. So that's one argument. There are other arguments which are based on, this western part of India linked with invasions over time. So merchants became powerful actors to support kings. But whatever the reason, from our perspective, what's remarkable is these communities started migrating in large numbers. The business people, not everyone, in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Right? And by the 20th centuries, you found them literally in every corner of India, especially Aurangabad. Right? So for example, in northern Maharashtra, if you ask, where are Marwadis found the most in India? Yes, Calcutta Marwadi, very famous. Many of them have left Calcutta. Some of them are in Bombay. Birla himself, moved. Aditya Birla, for example, moved from Calcutta to Bombay. But the biggest concentration of Marwadis is actually in northern Maharashtra. Right? So it is Aurangabad, Jalna. If you look at districts, Jalgaon, these are the districts with the largest concentration of Marwadis. And this migration started from the late 19th century. And there was pushback back then, so strong that the Times of India, back then, it had a different name, in 1848, Times of India is a very old newspaper, in 1848 they wrote an editorial saying, beware of the Marwadi. Right? This person goes around and destroys your local economy, is an evil money lender. 100 years later, of course, the newspaper is owned by Marwadi, right? So it continues to be so. And now you can't really write editorials like that anymore. These communities were extremely successful in the world of migration, but they also, like the labor migrants, retained a link with their base. Even today, Marwadi families will have a local religious function back home. Right? Now, the really interesting thing about the Marwadis in particular, I keep saying the Marwadis because they are the most successful business community of India. If you look at big business in India, huge Marwadi dominance. If you look at the gold medalists at Ahmedabad, huge dominance of Marwadis. Right? It's just remarkable brilliance at multiple levels. And the interesting thing is that most Marwadis are actually not from Marwar. Okay? They are from a place called Shekhawat, which is actually northern Rajasthan. So you think of Pilani, which is Bits Pilani, for instance. Pilani is not in Marwar, it's in Shekhawat. Birla probably being the most famous Marwadi businessman. But they were called Marwadis because the British called them Marwadis when they saw them in Calcutta. So it's a name that the Shekhawatis got wrongly, so to speak, in the 19th century. And it's a name which stuck on together. So today we refer to Marwadis as pretty much anyone from Rajasthan doing business, doing trade. But historically, the biggest migrant stock of Marwadis outside Rajasthan, they trace their ancestry not to Marwar, but to Shekhawat. Okay, Rajasthan has three big regions, Shekhawat, Mewar, and Marwar, and it's Shekhawatis. So most Marwadis you meet are actually probably not Marwadis. They are technically Shekhawatis. Okay. The Gujaratis have a much bigger international presence. They moved in much larger numbers outside India. But again, to give you this point, the main migration of most of these communities was within the subcontinent. Okay, so to give you a sense, almost every town in the world has a Gujarati Samaj. Okay, any mix. I used to live in St. Louis in the US. We had a Gujarati Samaj of St. Louis. Right? Not an Indian Samaj, a Gujarati Samaj. Very, very local. Right? But there are more such associations within India outside Gujarat, like Coimbatore Gujarati Samaj. I'm sure there's a Aurangabad Gujarati Samaj. Right? There are more such associations within India than outside India. And there's a word for this, it's called diaspora. Diaspora means dispersion, people dispersed. And we talk about the international diaspora all the time, but the really big diaspora of India is internal. And if you look at it linguistically, right, you can talk of a Gujarati diaspora, a Malayalam diaspora, a Tamil diaspora, and so on, all the major languages of India. And Malayalam, by the way, is the only language which has a larger international diaspora than an internal diaspora. But for almost all the major groups, the Marathi diaspora, for example, Marathi-speaking diaspora, much larger internally than internationally. Okay, I can go on each community, but I won't in the interest of time. And we can take it up in Q&A. This is a map of Marwadis and Gujaratis, for instance, 2001 census. This is based on the language census. So it's an undercount because a lot of people now speak Hindi. So this is just a map of mother tongue. But if you look at Marwadis, right? So obviously Rajasthan people, they're speaking Marwadi. So it's shaded in green. Green means there are more such speakers. But you see Maharashtra, right? That's where the Marwadis really are. That's the huge sense. And one of the reasons of Maharashtra's industrialization story of the last 75 years is closely linked with this particular fact. Right? Not just the Marwadis, but also Gujaratis who have migrated. So you see also a lot of Gujarati speakers. And you look at Aurangabad district, which is, this thing out here. Right? It's very much part of the central zone of the Marwadi diaspora. And we're talking of this diaspora as being at least 100 years old in its formation stage. Right? So are people today coming in large numbers? No. We're talking of an old group which has maintained a lot of its customs and traditions, speaking Marathi, fluent Marathi, right? Often, but still maintaining a base back in Rajasthan in terms of cultural kind of linkages. And similarly, Gujaratis, you also see a huge number of Gujarati in Tamil Nadu. Right? So if you go to Coimbatore, Salem, huge Gujarati diaspora which is out there. Okay, moving on to international migration. Okay, and here the interesting thing, of course, is the countries in which Indians go to. I'll start with the countries you have probably no idea about. For example, Italy. Right? We know now Italy because of variety of political factors, but Italy now has about 200,000 Indians. It's the second largest after UK. So a lot of Indians in UK, but outside the UK, Italy now has the largest number of Indians outside India in Europe, and almost all of them are from Punjab, and almost all of them are from one or two districts of Punjab, Hoshiarpur, Ludhiana, and almost all of them are working in the dairy sector. So if you go to Italy and eat cheese, there's a good chance it's being made by a Punjabi farmer who's basically working the lands in Italy today. Right? That's a much more recent story, the last 25 years story. But the big countries today are what we call as the U-turn or the three U's. So historically, the places on this map marked in red, like Burma, Myanmar, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Sri Lanka, East Africa, these are called the old diaspora. This is where Indians went between 1834 and 1920 in large numbers because of the British colonial system. Right? And their descendants, of course, are part of the Indian diaspora. So if you go to these countries, many times you'll see a lot of Indian-looking faces. Right? Suriname, a lot of people left Suriname at the time of independence from the Dutch in the 1970s. So there were about 200,000 Indians who went from Suriname to Netherlands. So if you go to Netherlands, there's a community of 200,000 Indians who moved from Suriname. Now they're called the Hindustanis. They live in the Netherlands. Africa, of course, large connections between Gujarat and East Africa. Interesting because they were asked to leave, famously by Idi Amin. So if you see the movie Last King of Scotland, there's a scene in which the Gujaratis are packing up their bags and leaving. After the dictator was toppled, they asked the Gujaratis to come back. They said, "We want the money, we want the investment, please come back." Right? So they're still wooing the Gujaratis back to places like Uganda, Tanzania, because a lot of them were asked to leave. They said the Indians came to build the railways are built, now you can go. Right? But of course, when you get migrants, typically migrants, almost by definition, are more risk takers because they've taken the risk to move out. Right? So it's almost like self-selection. When you see migrants versus non-migrants, you see arguably often much more of a drive to succeed because you've taken that initial risk to move out. Right? So there is that obvious thing. So you don't really want to take panga with migrants often, right? Because you often lose talent, like the East Africans have found out, much to their dismay. Okay, South Africa also old diaspora, and the new diaspora really is the three U's: UAE, UK, US. Right? UK because of partition, and then a lot of the Gujaratis from East Africa, like Rishi Sunak's ancestry, traces through Africa, went to UK, and the US is very, very interesting, right? Because Indians and Chinese started to go to US, and then the US erected a law in 1905, which basically said you can't come. Right? So they made a racist immigration law based on color of skin, which basically said you can't come. And they repealed that law only in 1965. So in 1965, they passed a new immigration bill in order to get more talent from around the world. So if you see US's migration history, they had about 50 years, 1870 to 1914, the Trump's grandfather era, where 50 million Europeans came. So most Americans trace their ancestry to Europe because of this migration wave. Right? Then they had a lot of internal migration, but it was a kind of a closed economy for some time until they opened out in the 1965. And in the next 60 years, in the last 60 years, two big strands of migration happened. One was from Mexico to US, which has now stopped or reduced. And the other was from India and China. Right? So Indians and Chinese started to go in large numbers to the US. They went in different forms, but a lot of it was high-skilled migration, right? And today, 1% of USA is Indian, which means the Indian diaspora in the US is 1%. It's the highest achieving diaspora. You look at almost any metric of development in the US, it's on the highest top of the charts. And that's partly because of self-selection. The people who went from India were top of the cream pretty much to begin with. So lots of community surveys in the US on Indians which show this. In India, the reaction to this was called brain drain. Right? So if you were living in the 70s and 80s, or even today sometimes, people talked about the brain drain. Why is it that people go to IITs, government-funded, subsidized education IITs, but then spend their life outside? Right? To which a politician in the 1970s says, well, it's better to have a brain drain than have a brain inner drain. Right? And there were all these kind of debates about, should we stop this migration? Is it bad? Today, all of that has changed. Nobody talks about brain drain anymore because we see the benefit of that migration. Because the money has come back often. The skills have come back often. Think about the IT industry, to some extent, many other industries. And we now talk about brain circulation. Right? So this whole idea of brain drain has given way to brain circulation. How do we make the most of the people who've gone abroad? And the more you try and constrain migration, the more people will leave. It's very tough to stop people's aspirations. Right? You think about people from Gujarat and Punjab who are stuck on the Mexican border. Right? Desperate migration, desperate to go. And Gujarat and Punjab are not the poorest parts of India. But there's a certain aspiration. And a lot of people are desperate, absolutely desperate to go to the US. And the numbers are, by the way, rising. It's not falling in any yardstick. Okay? So international migration has risen as a percentage of Indian population substantially over the last 30 years as globalization took place. In the last 4 years, especially after COVID, it is skyrocketed. So more Indians are leaving as a percentage of Indian population than any time before. Okay, but it was already high to begin with. As a percentage of Indian population, it's small. It's about 1%. But it's a rising number. And the issue now is, of course, that a lot of countries are putting these immigration barriers and making it very difficult for students to move, for a lot of other people to move. But broadly, most migration people don't think of it as a problem anymore. So will it stop? Well, eventually it might stop. But do you want to force it to stop? Probably not. It's like that rural development argument. Right? With rural development, you should not expect migration to stop. Rural development is good for its own end. Right? You build a school in a village, that's a great thing. But to expect the educated kids to stay there in that region is most unlikely. In fact, with more education, they're almost definitely going to leave. This is a kind of a weird argument you hear in rural development programs that, we did all this thing, but people are still moving. Well, most people themselves are migrants and most people are going to move. Right? So you can't really expect development to stop people from moving. And that is why in our lifetimes, Bihar and UP will continue to send out a lot of people. Kerala's migration will slow down for the simple reason that fertility has crashed, which means birth rates are lower. So the natural pressure on its land has reduced. Now, a flip of this map is the map on the right, which is where does the money from outside go? The money from outside India is coming to India. These are called remittances. India gets $130 billion worth of remittances. It's a massive number, much more than all of foreign direct investment consistently for the last 25 years. It's a huge part of India's balance of payments. About a third comes from the Gulf, a third comes from the US, and a third from the rest of the world. Right? And where is it going to? Some part of it goes to NRI deposits, which are in financial hubs like Bombay, some of it in Bangalore. But the family-to-family transfers hugely towards Punjab, towards Goa, towards Kerala. So these three are the top. If you look at a remittance to GDP ratio at the state level, Kerala it's 30%, Punjab and Goa are second and third. Right? So these are three of highly remittance-dependent states of India at an international remittance thing. A lot in Telangana. And the big story of the last 10 years is UP and Bihar. So through the Kerala connection, they realize we can earn much more in the Gulf. Right? So there are now more people going for working, let's call it, construction jobs in the last 10 years from UP and Bihar than from Kerala. So that's a big shift which has happened in that world. A nice image which I like to show of international migration. There's a pressure cooker, which is a classic symbol of Indian migration. When you leave the country, you have to take a pressure cooker and a mug often. This is the image of a particular entrepreneur who started this Ayurvedic spa clinic in Eastern Europe. And he just converted a little wooden chamber, but he's used the pressure cooker as the steam device, right? So you basically sit in this chamber, kind of an example of Indian ingenuity and how Indian entrepreneurship actually works often outside India. And finally, I'll just wrap it up now in a few minutes. You have involuntary migration, right? And India is a unique country of the world which has seen a lot of it. People talk about Syria's refugee crisis. The Bangladeshi refugee crisis in India in 1971 continues to be the world's largest refugee crisis that's ever taken place. Right? About 10 million Bangladeshis came in. Most actually went back. Some have stayed on. But if you look at India's history, we've had particular bouts of massive involuntary migration. Right? This is the first one. This is refugees leaving Mandalay. So the first big one was 42 when the Japanese attacked Burma. Lots of Indians who were in Burma, almost 1 million Indians, had to leave Burma and basically walk through the northeast frontier back to their homes in India. So that's the first big refugee migration. There's still Burma colonies in many parts of eastern India. Then you had 1947, the world's largest human movement that has ever taken place in a short period of time is the Indian partition. Right? And the Punjab side was fairly quick. The Bangladesh side, or let's say the Bengal side, was much slower. It took place over many more decades. But collectively, a lot of people not only moved, often against their choice, but a lot of people died. Right? And so it's been a very bloody kind of a migration which happened, but it has huge consequences for everything, especially in that region. Okay? You think of industries which came up in Punjab, often started by refugees. You think of Ulhasnagar in Mumbai. You think of Sindhi colonies in Maharashtra, huge number of Punjabis and Sindhis who moved because of this migration. And then 1971, the effects of which the Northeast in particular is still dealing with, right? This massive involuntary refugee migration which took place in 1971. So 3 big refugee migrations. And then there's the Tamil refugee migration. So in Tamil Nadu, there you have refugee camps across Tamil Nadu. Because of the Tamil problem, the LTT issues, back then a lot of Indian Tamils came as refugees, and they're still considered to be refugees. In fact, the largest refugee stock in India today is the Tamil refugee stock in Tamil Nadu. Then you have Tibetan refugees, Dharamshala and so on. Right? So India, despite not signing any international treaties on refugees, has a fairly amazing record of taking in refugees. Right? And it's quite remarkable actually. And of course, historically very famous for 2 communities, the Parsis and the Baghdadi Jews, 2 communities which escaped persecution and found a home in India. And for everyone says, you should not take any refugee and so on. These have been extremely successful communities in India. Right? Think of Parsi contributions across the board, and especially in the Indian military. Right? So the 71 war, if you see that famous photograph, or if you know about 71 war, the commanding general was a Parsi, Sam Manekshaw, and F.R. Jacob, who signed that agreement, was a Baghdadi Jew. Right? So given some time and assimilation, they might just win you wars as well in the future. Lots more on refugees. There's also the category of the internally displaced. Right? So that's a huge number. Since independence, about 45 to 50 million people have been displaced within India because of road construction projects, slum clearance programs, dams, you name it. Lots of development induced. That number is much more than the international refugee migration. Right? So that's a side topic which I won't go into. And finally, how do we kind of think about migration and development itself? Right? This is a cartoon which shows you kind of a slum-like situation with one nice house, right? One bright pakka structure. And this is Lakshman's cartoon. The common man is standing there, and he says, "Remember the carpenter who lived there? He's an NRI now. He had emigrated to the Gulf and is back." Right? So in this sea of poverty, there's this one house because of migration. Right? And that's often why people migrate, is because it is quite empowering. There are lots of stories in the book about how it can break down caste barriers. Right? Lots of work on Dalit millionaires in India, which will tell you that it's even more than, say, reservation, other programs. It is migration which has led to anonymity and hence a greater acceptance of failure that has led to amazing entrepreneurship. Right? So the act of moving is socially very empowering. Right? And I use this image to also contrast two big views on migration in India, which is between Gandhi on one hand and Ambedkar on the other. Right? And I see Ambedkar photos all across the city because of the event. Now, Gandhi had a very clear view: migration is bad. Right? He believed in an idea of village republics, migration, unless, of course, he also said that if you're getting persecuted, you should leave. He was very clear on that. But if there's no persecution, stay where you are. India lives in its villages. We have to develop our villages. And I would say the Gandhian logic on migration has prevailed in policy making for a very, very long time, which is the idea that if only villages are developed, nobody would have to migrate. Right? As opposed to the Ambedkarite view, which was very clear, which said migrate. Right? That is, this is your path to social empowerment. This is your path to economic empowerment. Right? And so I end this book by basically pointing out that my personal view, there's also, by the way, a third view, which is the Thackeray view. Right? That is, it's okay to move yourself, but there's this argument of nativism. Right? And a big battle of the 21st century. So in the 20th century, the big battle was between communism and capitalism. Right? That battle has pretty much been won. The big battle in this century is between cosmopolitanism and nativism. Right? And for example, look at what Trump is doing or what Europe is doing. A lot of the basis of protectionism is coming from the idea of nativism. Right? And in fact, in US today, for the Republican Party, the word globalist is seen as a bad word. Right? They say globalists have destroyed America. So there is an argument that cosmopolitanism is actually bad. Nativism, look for your own people at all times, which is very resurgent right now after a brief spell of about 30 years of very, very rapid globalization. And maybe this can be seen as an ideological balance. If you have too much movement, suddenly people become nativist. And maybe after a point, people will again start valuing the benefits of cosmopolitan. So as a cosmopolitanist myself, I, of course, take a very strong stand on this and say that, there's really no value to nativism. There's lots of arguments in the book on that. But really, when you think of it, they made a movie on Bal Thackeray. And who played the character of Bal Thackeray? Nawazuddin Siddiqui, right? A Muslim migrant worker from UP who played the character of Bal Thackeray, right? And this is not a movie which they did not support or anything, right? And if you look at that example, it kind of tells you everything, right? Because if you're looking for talent, it doesn't matter where you come from, right? It's at the end of the day, who can do the job best. And that is what the focus really, in my view, should be of. The Shiv Sena knows this. That's why they don't do too much as well on migration. As I said, they're very bright people in the Shiv Sena, both factions now. And I think intuitively they know that migration is very central for cities like Mumbai, Pune, and they won't go beyond a point. Beyond the elections, there's actually very little that's actually actively done against migrants on the ground. Gujarat, I've never heard of a single anti-migrant rhetoric in Gujarat, which is also an interesting thing. States which have themselves been migrant in cultural terms, like Gujarat and Kerala, you'll rarely see them abusing migrants. Right? I mean, if a Gujarati or a Malayalam person starts saying, we don't want people, right? It's very ironic, right? Because they've gone around the world. Right? Maharashtrians, yes, less migrant as a kind of community, as a language compared to the Gujaratis and the Malayalis. But you're more likely to hear it there. You're more likely to hear it in Kannada. You have an organization called the Kannada Rakshaka Vedike in Bangalore, very virulent and so on. And I'm ending this on this point because this also shows you the fault lines. And in the next 20, 30 years, one is international migration, but a huge fault line in India is internal migration and the political reactions to it. Because as you start seeing more north to south migration, you might just start seeing pushback from South Indian states saying, Hindi imperialism, we don't want so much of Hindi in South India. Unfortunately, you might start seeing a lot of walls, just like Trump has these walls on international movement. We might start seeing these walls within India very, very strongly. And you're already seeing that when you see the word job reservation for locals. If you ever see that in any political manifesto across political party lines, it's basically saying we are nativists and we will put nativism first over anything. it's anti-constitutional. It's not on, and hopefully doesn't catch fire. So I'll end here, going back to the first slide, which is Malik Ambar, and the slavery that brought him here and made him actually a very successful person at the end. And tell you a bit about IIM Ahmedabad, which is the institution I teach in. This is the logo of IIM Ahmedabad, and the logo comes from the Siddhi Sai Jali in Ahmedabad, a city whose name has not yet been changed. This particular logo, has an Arabic influence, and it comes from the descendants of the Siddhi community. Right? So we are very closely linked with the image on the left in our own identity as a person from this particular organization. And so migration has just remarkable properties in terms of cultural diffusion. Almost every food that you eat, has migrant property. Lots of places in the book where I talk about how it's impacted food. Think about music. Think about literally any cultural aspect. Think about why we are celebrating Ganpati across India, which is not the case, even 50 years back. But it's Maharashtrian associations across India which have taken, Ganesh celebrations. Or almost every city now has, Durga Puja celebrations. It's the Bengali movement of the last 20 years which has really popularized Durga Puja festivals across the country. Migration is around us everywhere. We often almost take it for granted. But when you find forces trying to block it, I think that's when you need to sit up. And because it's a deeply personal experience, you have to ask yourself, if I have benefited from migration, who am I to stop it, for others? Right? I think that's the fundamental point. And I'll end with this little joke on this particular kind of diagram. Malik Ambar came to India and gained upward mobility. And so I can tell my students of IIM Ahmedabad that it's very similar. Students come to IIM Ahmedabad and have a remarkable life of upward mobility afterwards. But unlike Malik Ambar, who was a slave and then became free, the students unfortunately, submit themselves to a lifetime of corporate slavery, right? So, which is unfortunate, but that's what seems to be happening many times with students. So, on that note, I'll end and happy to take questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for starting your.
Yeah.
Whose talk is also maybe 25 kilometers. My first question is you mentioned about sex ratio.
Yeah.
So because of female
Yeah.
decide, sex ratios went adverse in certain districts.
Punjab, Haryana in particular.
So Haryana, I understand, have lot of brides coming in from
Correct.
Odisha.
Yeah.
And villages after villages, now the native language is Udiya in
Interesting.
rural Haryana. So is it seen in many parts, and what is your comment on this phenomenon?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Short answer, no, it's very localized to Northwest India. From the first time we took censuses, which is 1872, this is a topic which has been referred to almost every census has remarked on the remarkable sex ratio of Punjab Haryana region, which at one point was like 750 women to 750 women to 1,000 males, right? So really skewed because naturally it's about 950 or 1,000. It's pretty balanced. But in Punjab and Haryana historically we've had, and earlier the problem was infanticide. Much more recently, slightly other problems, but at the root was some notions of gender discrimination. As a result of which, from the those censuses, they also recognized that precisely because you have more boys growing up than girls, when they reach marriageable ages, there's a deficit, right? So in economic terms, we say the marriage market does not clear, which means demand and supply does not match. So how do you match it? You need importation, in this case, of brides. And this has been happening for a long time, so mass migration of women to clear this marriage market in Haryana and Punjab from Eastern India, which has been noted by census officials from the late 19th century. What's changed slightly in the last, I would say, 25 years is that to clear this deficit, which is shrinking, it's not as bad as it was earlier, the pool of potential wives has gradually increased, and that is why you find newer places of India which are going to bridge this deficit. But it's not an all India issue. It's linked with literally a few districts in that part of India, because most parts of India the child sex ratios are fairly balanced. So this is the phenomenon of what Amartya Sen called as missing girls or missing women. And I would say it's not really generalizable to all of India. And as I said, a lot of India has missing men, which is in the 20 to 40 age group. So sex ratio of Ratnagiri, Udupi has never fallen below 1100 females to 1000 men for over 100 years. Over 100 years. You check any census document of the last 100 years, the sex ratio of Ratnagiri and Udupi district on aggregate has been more than 1100 females to 1000. So that's a phenomenon missing men. Right? So the men are going out, but it's at that age group, 20 to 40. Yeah.
Thank you. My second question is little historic.
Yeah.
When the Buddhism was spreading, it was spreading through traders, I was told.
Yeah.
And how it impacted immigration from the birthplace of Buddhism to all over peninsular India and also Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So short answer is I'm not an expert on ancient history at all. So the book has a few lines on this, but of course the book to read is William Dalrymple's The Golden Road, which has come out last year, which has a huge section on Buddhism and its spread across India, or rather it summarizes the literature on this topic very well. My limited comment is that compared to many religious philosophies in India, Buddhism has historically been quite pro-business, quite pro-trade, right? And similarly to the Jains, right? So you think of Jains across India, business is very natural. It's kind of very supported by the religion. So do I really have something new to say on Buddhist migration across the subcontinent or Asia? Not really. Unfortunately, I'm not the expert on this topic at all. But we do know it, of course, went a lot around Asia, and there must have been merchants associated with this at some level. And if you go to Nalanda, which is the original famous red brick institute of India, before Ahmedabad and MIT's new campus, which is also red brick. But before that, you had Nalanda. And that clearly tells you how integrated we were with a large part of Asia in terms of educational networks. Yeah, happy to take a few questions. Yeah.
I observed is last year. I was in Barcelona, and there I observed that almost every taxi driver and people working in
the Bangladeshi or no?
They all spoke Hindi.
Okay.
I did not ask them whether they were Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, or Indians.
Okay.
But then they very easily related with us, and like we were like family.
Correct.
First, I was in Barcelona, and that was a conference.
Yeah.
The biggest event. Some 60,000 delegates had come.
Yeah.
And probably 80% of them spoke Hindi or Gujarati or Marathi. So that had become the language of Barcelona.
Interesting.
But when we moved to Madrid, and that was after spending some 4 days in Barcelona, by which time it had gone in my brains that probably the language to be spoken outside or in departmental stores is Hindi. So there I went a small shop called Madrid's Spice Store. And I started speaking in Hindi, and surprisingly, he replied in Hindi. So there are certain pockets. And like they had not obviously come only for the conferences. They were settled there.
Yeah.
So
on very very specific. So what is the Indian story with Spain? Firstly, there's a larger Bangladeshi diaspora in Spain than an Indian diaspora from at least measured statistics. Secondly, there's a very interesting Punjabi connection. And this is a particular community called the Ravidasya community, which is one way to think of it as the Punjabi Dalit diaspora. And they have found a huge niche in Spain in particular. So there are at least 2 PhD theses now on this particular topic of a very interesting new diaspora, because it's not the slightly richer Punjabi farmers who've gone to Italy or Canada. Canada, of course, I've not mentioned. It's a huge Punjabi influence. But Spain is really a Punjabi migration story. So I'm surprised to know if people are speaking Marathi and other languages, then that suggests a much more broader kind of migration. But from what we know, a large part of Indian migration to Italy and Spain in the last 25 years comes from Punjab, but very different. The guys who went to Italy belong to certain castes and communities, and the people who went to Spain belong to, because it's all networked, right? So it's within your biradari that people are moving in a very strong case. Yeah. And in the case of Barcelona, of course, the old joke, that they have to depend on outsiders because bahar se lona. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Basically a major issue,
Yeah.
political issue
Today.
sometimes back, but that tendency still continue.
Yeah.
Because they more like Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. So that history is 100 years back. So I think 1914, if I'm not mistaken, is the year in which. So it's a lovely story. The Punjabis, like people from Uttarakhand, the Gorkha, there are particular regiments of the Indian Army which recruited a lot of people from certain districts. So Uttarakhand has a huge history of migration through British military networks, and the other one is Punjab. And the British actually moved from a system in the 19th century where they took people from across castes, like you have the Mahar regiment, the Maratha regiment, and so on. But in the early 20th century, they invented something called the martial race theory, and they said Punjabis are just naturally martial, right? And so it was complete invention, but they started recruiting a lot of Punjabis. So they would start moving now for military jobs, and within that British colonial system, one of the places they went to was Hong Kong. So there's in fact a book, Turban Traders in Hong Kong, on the history of Sikhs in Hong Kong. And there's still a small Sikh community in Hong Kong. So they became an integral part of the police of Hong Kong. Now, a few of those guys, so they started a connection between Punjab and Hong Kong, were very adventurous, and they said, chalo, America jate, North America. And they literally boarded this ship called the Komagatu Maru, and they sailed towards North America, the West Coast, Pacific, and they reached, it was headed towards what we now call as Canada, right? And they were turned back by the Canadian government at that time, saying, not allowed, right? Again, racist, and so on. So very famously, that ship took these long journey of packed with Punjabis, and they were turned back, and nobody gave them harbor support, so they had to come back. And it was seen as a huge sense of insult, a sense of, it became like a real crisis in the community, saying, how can people be so racist that after a long journey, they say you're not welcome at all. You're not even allowed to step foot on soil. Having said that, some of those guys who were going from Hong Kong started settling down in California. So even today, there's a Sikh farming community in California. And from California, they started moving across North America. So you started getting more Sikh Punjabis in particular going north, and finally hitting Canada. So the Canada diaspora in the Punjabi diaspora in Canada started to grow much faster than the Punjabi diaspora in US, because in US you're not allowed to go because they erected a very strong immigration wall. But in Canada, after that initial incident, they were slightly more open, especially because it was still part of the British imperial system. So more and more Punjabis started to go to Canada rather than the US. And I'm talking about pre-independence. And post-independence, again with partition, a lot of the Punjabis had a choice, whether we go to India or whether we go somewhere else. And that somewhere else became either UK or Canada. So a lot of them then moved to Toronto, a lot of them moved to particular places in Canada. So UK, if you go around Heathrow Airport, or if you go to Toronto, you find a huge Punjabi cluster, not just Indian, but a Punjabi cluster. So that's a network which grew. And then the second story is the Khalistani movement of the 1980s. So that at that point, a lot of the activists found refuge in Punjab. So now they would go reach Canada and say, I have not come here for economic work. I'm an asylum refugee seeking refuge in your country because India is persecuting me. Right? So there was a whole refugee migration from India. Right? The only real documented case of this till date is this particular migration where they landed up, and of course the Indian government was paranoid and said, what nonsense, how can you say that we are persecuting them? But they went up and they got asylum. The Canadian government treated them as refugees, being persecuted by India, and hence we are giving them asylum. So that became a new migration network. And it's this combination of that old Punjabi diaspora and slightly new diaspora, which has then become a very strong overall diaspora out there. And in the last 20-30 years, of course, student migration. Right? So massive number of students from Punjab again who started going. So there are 3 different waves of migration to Punjab have led to a very, very strong Punjabi identity out there. And if you look at the cabinet of Trudeau, you see so many Sikhs. And unfortunately, in my view, that Khalistani movement is still strong there because those activists who were not shot in India, many of them have continued operations there. And they kind of continue to dream of like a separate homeland and stuff like that. So situation right now is quite crazy in some of the suburbs where they have these, they have these cutouts of Indira Gandhi where they're saying, like burning effigies of Indira Gandhi even today. It's a crazy memory of that whole 1980s episode, which is still there. And of course, they're being supported politically because of their vote bank politics and stuff like that. So that's a separate. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole Air India bombing which took place linked with all the issues of the 1980s. So it's a very tortured history, and all I can say is that I'm going to Canada in a couple of months. I don't know if I'll get the visa in time because it takes a long time now to get a visa. Our diplomatic relations are so bad with Canada that things are quite tough, which is never the case. India and Canada have always kind of been diplomatically very strong. So I think hopefully that clarifies the Punjabi connection with Toronto in particular today. Huge Toronto, suburbs of Toronto, hugely influenced. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. The book does talk about them in a few lines. Gypsies, nomadic people in especially Eastern Europe. If you've seen this movie called Chocolat, there's a whole description. Seen in very negative terms in Europe. They're seen as people who come, steal children, and lots of kind of stories, stereotypes which are made about the gypsy community. And in many parts of the world, gypsy as a word itself is seen in negative terms. Now, I failed to mention this. One way to understand long migration histories is through genetic studies. Right? That is, you take DNA samples, and today, of course, it's very popular. They can tell you, I don't quite trust this whole methodology, but it says you're 16% this and 15% that, 20% Chinese and 30% Turkish or whatever. But there is a method, a genetic kind of idea of establishing your roots and so on. But what's interesting about the gypsies is that they've done these genetic studies and is a very, very close match to a community from Punjab. So they've established this link because they were linguistic links. So often in these anything in ancient history, it's a combination today of linguistic studies and genetic studies. And think of the Aryan migration hypothesis also. It started with linguistic data and now it's being more corroborated or contested using genetic data. So with the gypsies, yes, there's a strong connection which genetic studies have picked up. The other community where the genetic studies are showing some link is the Kayasts. So every community of India typically has an origin myth. Right? That is, we come from this. So think of Saraswat Brahmins or whatever. There's a particular idea of our origin and the reason for the origin. Like Udupi, a lot of them say, there was a flood in Udupi and that's why people started moving. Often it's not true, but it's a very strong part of identity. And in the case of Kayasts, they said, in Bengal in particular, there's this whole idea that they came from Kannauj and they were sent and they got some land grants from the king some few hundred years back and so on. And the Kayasts are a very prominent community in Calcutta in particular. So there's a genetic study which looked at people in Kannauj of this community and out here, and it found weak statistical support, however you want to interpret it. But so I'm just saying there is a line of research now because of the question on methodology, which uses genetic studies. But as with all research, I think you need to corroborate with all these other clues which are often traced in data. The oldest migration data, migration story which is mentioned in the book relates to the Saurashtra Madurais. So this is a community, a Gujarati community. It's a community found in Tamil Nadu with origins in Saurashtra. And Saurashtra as a word has been used in Sanskrit literature since ancient times. But what's interesting about this migration is that you have evidence of land grants, inscriptions for 1500 years. So you can trace their migration from Saurashtra to what we now call as Madhya Pradesh, to then south, and then eventually Tamil Nadu. So it's an amazing kind of connection. And these were mostly weavers, so in textiles. And most interestingly is that at the time of marriage, the marriage ceremony, the priest basically asked the bride and the bridegroom to narrate certain lines. And those lines are basically the migration history of the bride and the groom. So they have to repeat saying, I am so and so, and my father came from here, and my grandfather came from here, and my great grandfather. So it's encoded in wedding rituals. So it's a very fascinating kind of a community, which is probably the community which is best understood from a long migration history. Like 1500 years is about as big as it gets to trace a community. People from Saran in Bihar, we have evidence of migration in military networks from the 15th century. So that's also 600 years. They've been on the move for 600 years as a localized migration. First military networks, then eventually jute mills of Calcutta, and today pretty much all over India. So Saran district is one, again, unique district. Ratnagiri also, the Ratnagiri connection in Bombay started with the Maratha army. So a lot of folks who worked for the Maratha army would send money, but these were pensions or remittances as soldiers. The Bombay link did not really start in the textile industry. It started in the Bombay police. And because of these military connections, they were the first people, the Marathas of Ratnagiri, were the first people employed by the Bombay police. Even today, Mumbai police is hugely dominated by the Marathas, which again tells you a network which started 150 years back, which is so strong even today. And then from the Mumbai police, cotton textile mills, docks, huge part of the Bombay economy, Ratnagiri was the obvious source of labor over time. So it's a very fascinating world, because often there's a first migrant or the first few migrants, and then they build a whole network which kind of brings them on. One of my favorite stories out here is the connection of Kerala with the Gulf. Right? How did Kerala get connected with the Gulf? But for that, you have to read the book. Yeah. Thank you.
What a fascinating presentation, sir. Thank you, sir, for taking us through such a powerful and eye-opening narrative.
As we conclude this enlightening session, it's a time to express our heartfelt gratitude. First and the foremost, sincere thank you to Professor Chinmay Tumbe sir for sharing his deep insights and for taking us through such compelling journey of migration and identity. Sir, it was a great honor today for all of us to be blessed with your presence of you as a learned scholar. With due respect and admiration, I also take this opportunity to extend my thank you to our management team, GSM, especially Dr. Yajnavir Kaude sir, for making this event a possible outcome. Thank you, sir. A big thank you to Professor Munish Sharma sir for supporting and guiding this initiative with such a dedication. I'm grateful to our director, Dr. Nilesh Patil sir, for being supportive to organize such a fruitful program. I take this opportunity to thank Mr. Sanjay Deshmukh sir, Director, Skill Development, MIT, for organizing such a great event. I even take this privilege to express my gratitude towards Mr. Prayag Pandey sir, Deputy Director, Skill Development, MIT, for his significant guidance and support for this event. Last but not the least, to all the book lovers of Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar and faculty member, I thank you all for listening patiently. Thank you.
Dear audience, I would like to make one announcement before I declare the end of this program. First of all, arrangement of high tea is made outside on the lawn. And secondly, books are kept for sellout on the right side of the auditorium. The guest will sign with the cup of tea. Even I would like to state here that if anyone is interested in receiving any additional information related to CSN Book Club, then please provide your name and contact details in the sheet kept in the bowl outside. Dear book lovers, next month we will be having a review on the book Shri Krishnaji Vinayak Vazir Gaurav Granth by an eminent author, Mr. Vijay Prasad Upadhyay. Do not miss the erudite personality. Thank you once again for being with us. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep reading. Thank you.